welcome you to the Sewall Belmont House and Museum, the home of the historic National Woman's Party. Today we will be enjoying a brief tour, and I hope that you come to visit us soon to see these and many other objects in person, and to celebrate the continuing progress of women's equality.
On the corner of Constitution Avenue and 2nd Street Northeast, next to the U.S. Capitol, sits the Sewall Belmont House, home of the National Woman's Party. For more than 60 years, this house has been at the center of the American women's rights movement, a destination where activists congregate to fight for political, economic, and social equality for women. The Sewall Belmont House has been an integral part of the history of civil rights in America. July 1848, Seneca Falls, New York. Nearly 300 women and several dozen male supporters, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, gather at the first Women's Rights Convention. They issue a resolution, the Declaration of Sentiments. It states all men and women are created equal and includes a radical demand for the universal right to vote. It is the first battle cry for women's suffrage, and it will be decades before victory is declared. Success will come from a brave new generation of activists who are sophisticated, savvy, and determined to make real change for women in America. Their leader is a 29-year-old Quaker named Alice Paul.
Welcome to the Sewall Belmont House and Museum. My name is Elspeth Kirsch. I am the Collections and Facilities Manager here. Today we will be enjoying a tour of the house, which focuses on the history and legacy of the National Woman's Party. We like to begin our discussion of the NWP here at Sewall Belmont by talking about its relationship to the British suffrage movement. American women who were involved in the suffrage cause, both before and after the Civil War, often found their energies quite scattered. They were involved in issues of judicial equality, economic equality. Many of them were fighting to maintain property after marriage, and other really important moments and tasks in American history. What makes the NWP unusual is that they were committed to fighting for suffrage on a federal scale, and the NWP had a single plank, women's equality. And so this platform took its original militant roots in the activism of the British suffrage movement. So we like to start our tours here at Sewall Belmont by looking at the relationship between the American and British suffrage movement. And we also talk about the very important other groups that were involved in American suffrage, including the National Association for Women's Suffrage, NASA. NASA was based in New York City and was led by many of the great luminaries, the great foremothers, if you will, of American suffrage and equality. Carrie Chapman Catt, Harriet Stanton Blatch. These women were part of a large movement that was committed to suffrage on a state-by-state basis. And so here, in this image, you have two of the main women of NASA lecturing to a packed hall in New York. We also have a really interesting artifact, one of my absolute favorites here at Sewall Belmont. This is a jail door pin that belonged to Betsy Graves Renault. The jail door pin was modeled on what was called the Holloway brooch. The Holloway brooch was a gift to women in Britain who had participated in the British suffrage movement and who had been imprisoned in Holloway Jail. Holloway Jail is a very Victorian Gothic prison on the outskirts of London. It's cold, it's dark, and many members of the American suffrage movement spent time in jail in England for their activities on behalf of British women. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns both were imprisoned in Holloway Jail, and Alice Paul used the brooch that she was given as a gift as the model for this pin, which was then given to 89 women who participated in the NWP pickets in the United States and who were sent to prison. And so we like to display this pin here as a concrete example of the relationship between British and American suffrage. When Alice Paul came back from Britain, she brought with her the militant tactics that had been developed and used with great success by the Pankhurst family. And these tactics included throwing acid into mailboxes and bricks through windows. And my personal favorite stunt, the Pankhursts participated in mailing a cow to the British Prime Minister in order to generate publicity for women's suffrage. When Alice Paul came back to the United States, she rejoined NASA, which at that point was the premier organization for women's suffrage in this country. And she led an important delegation to their convention in Philadelphia in 1912. While she was in Philadelphia, NASA decided to send her to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress. They gave her a budget and a mailing list and sent her on her way. Alice Paul used that budget to organize the parade that was held on March 3rd, 1913.
March 3rd, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. Thousands of women assemble at Alice Paul's urging and march down Pennsylvania Avenue. They're demanding the right to vote. It is a spectacle never before seen in the nation's capital. But as the march proceeds, violence erupts. The crowds trip, grab, and shove the marchers, shouting obscenities at them. The police refuse to intervene, and the cavalry must be called in to crush the riot. In the end, 100 people are hospitalized. But the media coverage brings this story to the national stage, exactly as organizers had planned. Alice Paul and her fellow activists have waited long enough for meaningful change. They found the National Woman's Party and are determined to do whatever it takes to achieve the ultimate goal, a constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote.
The March 3rd, 1913 parade, which involved 5,000 women marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, would have been an incredibly striking visual. The women marched in matching purple silk cloaks that had high stand-up collars. They wore hats and carried banners identifying their relationship to other women. And so women marched under the banner of their college or their profession. So there were banners for nurses or actresses. There was also a contingent of housewives that marched under a housewife banner. And the women that participated in this parade were part of the largest protest in America for suffrage at that time. These 5,000 women joined at the Capitol and intended to march down Pennsylvania Avenue in an organized, dignified protest. However, it did not go entirely as planned. The city was full of people who had come to enjoy President Wilson's inauguration, and many of the people were quite drunk. The District of Columbia police officers did not allocate enough staff to protect the women as they marched, and the thin rope barriers that they erected on the streets were not effective in holding back what was a very, very rowdy crowd. The women, as they marched, were pelted with rocks and sticks, broken bottles, and they continued to march peacefully. However, the continued throwing of these dangerous materials resulted in a riot, and over 100 people were sent to the hospital, both marchers and people who had come to participate and watch the march. This is very important because it's the first time that American suffrage was back on the front page of the newspaper since before the American Civil War. And Woodrow Wilson, very famously, was quite frustrated that he had to share his big newspaper headline the day of his inauguration with these women who he said had short skirts and even shorter hair. The American suffrage movement got a shot in the arm as a result of this parade, and Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and the other members of the National Woman's Party were off on a very important journey that would culminate in the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. The NWP was very conscious that it needed to create a systematic connection to the great foremothers of the American suffrage movement. So here at the Sewall Belmont House, we are pleased to display two of the most important objects from the American suffrage movement, even though they did not belong to Alice Paul or Lucy Burns. The materials that I'm talking about are this desk, which belonged to Susan B. Anthony and was used at the Seneca Falls Convention, and that chair, which belonged to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Both of these objects were part of the collection of the NWP, and they appeared very frequently in NWP promotional materials. This image is incredibly famous and important. You see Alice Paul and Alva Belmont seated at Susan B. Anthony's desk in a publicity photograph for the National Woman's Party, and this very consciously connected the work of the NWP with the work of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the other great feminist luminaries who had participated in the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. This gallery focuses on the tactics and strategies employed by the National Woman's Party in their efforts to win suffrage. I like to start when I bring people here by talking about this absolutely wonderful valentine that was created as part of a 1916 campaign to encourage members of Congress to support the women's suffrage amendment. You can see that it is personalized. It was sent to Congressman Robert Henry Lee of Texas, and you'll see that his name is there in the valentine. These valentines, of which every single member of Congress received a personalized one, were part of an overall charm offensive that was devised by the NWP to encourage members of Congress to support suffrage. But the NWP was not just a group of women who wanted to hold tea parties and talk about voting. They also developed the first serious boots-on-the-ground lobbying techniques, many of which are still in use today. One of the most important aspects of the collection here, which part of them are displayed here in this room, are the Congressional Card File. The Congressional Card File, which was dubbed by the New York Times as the Deadly Political Index, represented a systematic record of every single interaction the NWP had with an elected official. It included his position on suffrage and then later the Equal Rights Amendment, his political background, where he had grown up, what his wife thought of suffrage, where his children were educated, the percentage by which he had been elected, and other really important statistics that allowed the NWP to craft personalized lobbying campaigns. And it's one of the great reasons that they were so successful. So today, if you look at a website that talks about many candidates' positions on an issue, you are using a technique that was developed by the National Woman's Party. The NWP also participated in a number of really exciting publicity campaigns. The all-female auto tours involved women driving across the country, many of them on roads that were poorly maintained and not paved. And these car trips involved speaking tours. The women would travel around the country speaking on behalf of suffrage and equal rights. Many members of the NWP participated in leaflet bombing. We have a wonderful photograph of Lucy Burns in an airplane wearing a NWP sash on her chest, getting ready to throw leaflets out over New York City and many western states. The NWP developed these publicity stunts as a way of gathering public attention to their cause. They also developed the first pickets of the White House. Today, we consider picketing in front of the White House to be common, but the NWP was in fact the first organization to participate in an organized picket of the White House.
Energized by media coverage of the parade, Alice Paul follows up with another kind of publicity stunt. All-female automobile tours, some coast to coast, on roads that are rarely paved. In 1917, Alice Paul plans the party's most daring media blitz, a picket of the White House, the first group ever to do so. Women carry banners criticizing the president. But World War I is raging overseas, and dissent against the government is seen as treasonous. The pickets spark riots among onlookers, and Wilson orders the women arrested. In all, some 2,000 women picket. A quarter of them are detained on a charge of obstructing traffic. In prison, they are badly mistreated, some even beaten unconscious. They go on hunger strikes to protest. In response, prison guards force-feed them, violently shoving tubes up their noses and down their throats. Lucy Burns, co-founder of the National Woman's Party, and others detail the brutality on scraps of paper smuggled out of prison and into the hands of reporters. The articles they write mobilize supporters across the country. Amid public pressure, the president backs down.
The pickets that were held in front of the White House starting in 1917 represented an incredible leap forward in political activism in America. Over 500 women regularly stood in front of the White House as silent sentinels. They held banners that directly spoke to President Wilson, asking, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And later, as America became more involved in World War I, the banners referenced the conscription of American citizens. One very famous banner said, "Mr. President, it is unjust to deny women a voice in their government when the government is conscripting their sons." The NWP held regular pickets 6 days a week in front of the White House and created hundreds and hundreds of banners for use in these pickets. After many of the women were arrested, and they had been arrested repeatedly, they would often be arrested and then freed, arrested again. The women continued to increase the pressure on President Wilson, culminating in what we today call the watchfire protests. Alice Paul brought a large barrel in front of the White House and lit a fire in the barrel. And while the fire was burning, she and other members of the National Woman's Party read speeches that had been given by President Wilson. Then they threw them in the barrel and burned them. This was an extremely inflammatory gesture and also demonstrated that the National Woman's Party was not going to back away from public pressure, even though the United States was involved in World War I. And this increasing pressure, which included many women spending time in both the district jail and the Occoquan workhouse, where they were force-fed and absolutely punished for their political beliefs, represented a cohesive effort by the members of the National Woman's Party to pressure both the president and the federal government at large to change its position on women's suffrage. So, in 1920, when suffrage was added to the United States Constitution after a lengthy ratification process, it represented an incredible victory for the nearly 60,000 women who had been part of the National Woman's Party and part of the suffrage movement. This table is set to look as it would have looked when the National Woman's Party lived and worked here. They moved into this house in 1929 after the successful fight for suffrage, but they continued for nearly 50 years to work for equal rights and over 600 other pieces of legislation to establish political, judicial, and economic equality for women. So the materials set here represent what the table would have looked like when the NWP was here. We have examples of the congressional card file, which we invite people to flip through. They are a remarkable window into the political lobbying techniques of the NWP. We also have a typewriter, which many of our younger visitors find very, very fascinating.
The women are set free and immediately cross the country by train to further promote their cause. A few weeks later, Wilson decides to back the constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote. For the next 20 months, members of the National Woman's Party fight for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in the House, the Senate, and finally, state by state. More than 70 years after the battle began, the 19th Amendment is ratified, becoming law on August 26, 1920. For the first time in American history, the country's 20 million women have the legal right to vote. For Alice Paul and members of the National Women's Party, however, the struggle for equality is far from over. In 1929, the NWP purchases one of Washington's most prominent houses, located just a block from Congress. From this house, members of the party draft more than 600 pieces of legislation in support of women's issues at the local, state, and federal level, half of which are passed. For years, they lobby to pass the Equal Rights Amendment and back campaigns to get women elected to office. Their work continues for decades.
We refer to this as the International Gallery. When people think of the National Woman's Party, many of them believe that the story of American suffrage and American women's equality stops in 1920, and that's actually could not be further from the truth. This gallery focuses on the post-suffrage work of the National Woman's Party, both domestically and internationally. The National Woman's Party was instrumental in writing the text of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was introduced in 1923 by two legislators from Kansas, one of whom was in fact a descendant of Susan B. Anthony. This amendment, which was originally referred to as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, unfortunately has not been ratified. However, the political discussion surrounding the Equal Rights Amendment has also included over 600 pieces of women's equality legislation, of which about 300 were passed. And the NWP was instrumental in both writing and lobbying for all of these pieces of legislation. The NWP also supported women who ran for political office, regardless of Democratic or Republican affiliation. The NWP, in fact, today, as an educational group, continues to support women in political office because we believe it is important that women be adequately represented in their government. So this gallery also focuses on the international contributions of the NWP. The NWP and its sister organization, the World Women's Party, or WWP, were focused on improving the status of women abroad. The NWP believed that if they could change the status of women abroad, this would pressure the United States government into passing and ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment. However, the NWP was very dedicated to improving the status of women abroad. They commissioned pioneering studies on public health, maternal education, and woman-based microfinance, many of which remain the bellwethers of these academic pursuits today. We also have on display one of the most unusual objects in the NWP collections, which we call the Martine banner. This was created in 1938 and was carried in Havana, Cuba at an equality protest and a funeral service for the poet Jose Marti. And what is so remarkable about this banner is that in both Spanish and English, it refers to the importance of women's equality, saying women should have the same right to vote as men have. This is a great distillation of what is, for many people, a complicated issue. But equality comes down to an equal voice in one's government. And so the NWP and its work in Brazil, Haiti, Cuba, and many other Central and Latin American states had at its heart the goal of women's equality both at home and abroad.
For the half-hour show, unfortunately, we're at 20 minutes right now. And so whatever you're going to say, like I have opening credits and closing credits and
This is a portrait of Inez Milholland Boissevin. Inez was one of the most interesting members of the National Woman's Party. She was a Vassar-educated labor lawyer who was profoundly committed to women's equality in many forms. In addition to her suffrage activism, she also traveled extensively throughout Europe to promote peace during the battles of World War I. Inez rode at the front of the March 3rd, 1913 parade on a white horse named Grey Dawn. Inez was dressed to look like Joan of Arc, who was considered by many to be the patron saint of the suffrage movement. And this beautiful painting, which was conserved through the generosity of many of Inez's family and descendants, is one of my favorite pieces here at the National Woman's Party at Sewall, Belmont. It's a beautiful painting, and it represents the contributions of this remarkable woman who in fact was so committed to suffrage that she collapsed on stage during a speech and died shortly thereafter of anemia and pneumonia. She publicly gave her last words, which were, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" We also have a museum store which sells, among other things, reproductions of the china used by the National Woman's Party in their tea rooms at Jackson Place and Cameron House. We sell suffrage tea, suffrage soap, because equal suffrage makes for clean politics, and a number of books and related materials that are of interest to women who are continually committed to the cause of equality. Many of our materials are also available online on our website, www.sewellbelmont.org.
Today, the Sewall Belmont House stands as one of the nation's most important monuments to the ongoing battle for equality for women and to the dramatic achievements of the National Woman's Party.
I'm Elspeth Kirsch, the Collections and Facilities Manager at the Sewall Belmont House and Museum, the home of the historic National Woman's Party. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.